Hello everyone, as promised I'm hoping to start doing some videos with respect to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So this will be the first of those videos. Particularly we're looking at sessions 11 and 12 where the lecture objectives are to distinguish between the Keynesian and the classical aggregate supply curves, to understand the price adjustment mechanism and how this relates to aggregate supply over different time frames. We'll talk about the derivation of the aggregate demand curve, and we'll also try to understand how demand and supply interact with different policy interventions. This is quite a long session, so I'm going to try and split it up into two videos. Alright, to start, why do we look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Well, what we've been doing up until now is considering the long-run growth trajectory of economies. So if you imagine a business cycle diagram where you're measuring changes or the economic growth rate over time, what you would have is a general upward trend in most cases. In some countries that trend would be faster than in other countries, for example. But overall, what you would see is fluctuations around that long-run positive upward trend. And that would be the business cycle that you would be observing, that in some instances economic growth will be increasing and in other instances economic growth will be declining. So the business cycle shows that economic activity fluctuates around the long-run growth trend. Much of that fluctuation or the instability in the short run can be attributed to fluctuations or changes in the demand for goods and services in an economy, so specifically due to fluctuations in aggregate demand. As the demand for goods and services changes in the short run, this can affect both the level of employment and unemployment and results in something called cyclical unemployment if there's a temporary decline in the demand for goods and services, for example. Or alternatively, if the economy is expanding really rapidly, you could end up with inflation happening and the economy could be overheating. As the production of goods and services rises rapidly, prices also rise rapidly. And both of these macroeconomic concerns, the problem of unemployment and the problem of inflation, can be illustrated using aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now just remember that aggregate demand and aggregate supply are a representation of a real-world economy. Admittedly, this is a very abstract representation of an economy, but what we do in economics is we try to identify the key elements of how an economy would work, and we use our theories to explain these key elements with a view to better understanding how the economy works. In reality, there are many different things that could affect unemployment and that could affect inflation. So for now, we're thinking very broadly about the aspects and about the parts of the economy that could affect the inflation rate and that could affect the unemployment rate. What does the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model look like? Well, the diagram here on the left-hand side shows us that when we're talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, what we are measuring on the horizontal axis is output or income. Remember, in economics, specifically in macroeconomics, the production of goods and services, or output, results in the generation of income, which results in the opportunity to spend on the output which is being produced. So we often see the words output, income, and spending being used interchangeably in macroeconomics. Here what we're measuring is output or income, denoted by the symbol Y. So what you can think of this as is real GDP. On the vertical axis, we are measuring the price level. You'll recall from Econ 102 that the price level is essentially an index. We can think about the price level being measured by the consumer price index, or a GDP deflator, or a producer price deflator, for example. And then what you have over here then is this price level. And as we move up the axis from 0 up to the top, what we would be suggesting is that the price level is increasing. what we could then do is work out the inflation rate as the price level changes. In the price and output space, we have two different lines or curves drawn in, and we'll start with the black line, which is aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve is negatively sloped. It suggests that when prices in the economy are high, the quantity of output demanded is going to be low. Alternatively, when prices in the economy are low, the quantity of output demanded is going to be high. In other words, there is an inverse relationship between the quantity of output demanded and prices. As goods and services become more expensive and the price level rises, the quantity of those goods and services demanded in the economy will fall. But as the price level decreases and goods and services become cheaper to purchase, the quantity of those goods and services demanded will increase. So that's the aggregate demand curve, and it is negatively sloped, illustrating an inverse relationship between the price level and the level of output. The blue line refers to the aggregate supply curve. What we are going to see later is that the aggregate supply curve can actually take on many different positions or slopes. We deal with the horizontal aggregate supply curve as well as a vertical aggregate supply curve, for example. For now, though, we've drawn in a positively sloped aggregate supply curve. You'll see later we refer to this as the medium run aggregate supply curve. And what it shows is that at low price levels, firms are not willing to supply that much output to the market, so the quantity of output supplied is low. However, as prices increase and we move up this aggregate supply curve, it's suggesting that at higher prices, firms would become willing to supply a far greater quantity of output. The reason why firms are willing to supply more at a higher price is because they're motivated by profits. If firms supply more output and are able to sell it at the higher price, they would make a greater profit. Equilibrium here is where the demand for goods and services is equal to the supply of goods and services, and that's shown by the intersection of the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve. This then represents the observed price level and the observed level of output in the economy at a particular point in time. Note that if prices were above the equilibrium level, the quantity of goods supplied would exceed the quantity of goods demanded, and this would put downward pressure on prices, and the economy would move back to the equilibrium at E. Alternatively, if we think about a situation where the price level is below the equilibrium price level, then the demand for goods and services, the quantity of goods and services demanded, would exceed the supply of goods and services. This excess demand would put upward pressure on prices, causing prices to rise until eventually the economy reached the equilibrium level of prices and output at point E. We will go into much more detail in a later video about how changing the demand for and the supply of goods and services can affect the equilibrium in the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply model. For now, it's sufficient to note that if you start at a particular equilibrium point where the demand for goods and services equals the supply of goods and services, then we can think about a situation where demand could increase, or demand could decrease, or supply could increase, or supply could decrease. What I suggest you do is draw out those 4 different possibilities, and they're described here in the slides: an increase in aggregate demand, a decrease in aggregate demand, an increase in aggregate supply, and a decrease in aggregate supply. And I suggest that you draw these out and see if you can establish that indeed the prices and the level of output will change in the directions which are shown in the slide. The important thing to note, though, is that just because we talk about an equilibrium where demand equals supply, it is possible, and in fact the whole point of studying this is to recognize that the supply of goods and services may change, and also that the demand for goods and services may change, and that those two things changing could affect the equilibrium level of prices and the equilibrium amount of outputs. The other thing to note, though, is that in addition to the fact that those curves can shift, the amount of change in prices and output following an increase or decrease in either aggregate demand or aggregate supply depends critically on the slope of the aggregate supply curve. Is it flat? Is it positively sloped? Is it vertical? It depends critically on the slope of the aggregate demand curve. Although we don't really pay much attention to this, you should bear in mind that we can think about the demand curve as being quite steep or about the demand curve being quite flat. And depending on whether the demand curve is steep or flat will determine the amount by which prices change as well as the amount by which output changes. The third thing which becomes important is by how much is demand and supply changing. Has there been a really big accumulation of inputs, for example, that causes the supply of goods and services to increase by a big amount? With regards to the demand for goods and services, has the government, for instance, increased its expenditure by a huge amount, and that huge amount is then being multiplied through the economy and causing an increase in aggregate demand? Essentially, how big or what the size or the magnitude is of the shift in aggregate supply or aggregate demand will matter in terms of determining by how much prices and output change when aggregate supply and or aggregate demand changes. For now, though, what we want to do is contrast the very extreme cases of aggregate supply. And we're going to start by looking at the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, which is a horizontal curve. So what you can see here is that the space is the same. We are measuring on the horizontal axis output or income, denoted by Y, so this is real GDP. And on the vertical axis, we're measuring the price level. And as I said before, this could be a consumer price index, for example. What the Keynesian aggregate supply curve suggests is that firms are able to supply whatever amount of goods and services are demanded at the existing price level. In other words, the aggregate supply curve is horizontal. So, for instance, and let me just very crudely draw this in, if the demand for goods and services is low, here we go, if the demand for goods and services is low, firms will supply a low quantity. If the demand for goods and services is high, AD0, firms will supply a higher quantity. Well, let's make that a 0 to coincide with the label on the aggregate demand curve. Alright, so essentially then, in the Keynesian case, where the aggregate supply curve is horizontal, we're suggesting that firms can supply whatever quantity of goods and services is demanded at the price level. So if demand is low, they can supply Y1 at a price of P prime. If demand is high, they can supply Y0 also at a price of P prime. Why are they able to supply these different quantities all at the same price? In the Keynesian case, we are thinking about an economy which is characterized by very, very high levels of unemployment and lots of underutilized or unutilized resources. And since such a great amount of unemployment exists, it could be argued that firms will be able to obtain any amount of inputs that they need, including labor, at the going wage rate. In other words, when firms experience the increase in the demand for goods and services, they would be able to expand output by hiring more labor, for example. When they do so, the marginal cost of hiring the additional workers will not increase. If the marginal cost of hiring the additional workers won't increase, then the average costs of firms' production don't change, and if average costs of firms' production don't change, firms are willing to supply as much as is demanded at the existing price level. So the Keynesian aggregate supply curve is then really representing a type of economy where there is widespread unemployment and a huge underutilization of resources. As we will see later on, we also can think about the Keynesian aggregate supply curve as representing short-run aggregate supply. Because in the short run, from today to tomorrow to the end of the week, perhaps to the end of the month, it would always be possible for firms to expand the amount of output that they produce, and for that to have only a negligible, if any, effect on the price that they are selling their goods and services at. The origin of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve was because when Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, was writing, it was around about the Great Depression, when there was widespread unemployment and when there was a widespread underutilization of resources. So it seemed that firms were able to increase production without increasing prices, simply because they were able to put the idle capital and labor, the unutilized capital and labor, to work. Another way of thinking about the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, though, is to think about it as representing a situation where prices are sticky. In other words, sticky prices means that they don't really adjust to changes in the demand for goods and services. Firms could be reluctant to change prices and wages when the demand for goods and services changes, and this causes prices to be viewed as sticky or stuck. They don't change. We will examine in a later session some of the explicit reasons why firms might be reluctant to change prices and reluctant to change wages. In other words, we will explore in more detail some of the reasons why prices and wages could be viewed as sticky. When prices are viewed as sticky, rather than changing the price level, firms instead increase or decrease output in response to changes in aggregate demand. So essentially, here we're suggesting that the aggregate supply curve will be flat when prices are sticky. Alright, we contrast that with the classical aggregate supply curve. The classical aggregate supply curve, measured in the same space as before, let me go back to the pointer if it will let me. We're still measuring real GDP or output on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we are measuring the price level. And here, the classical aggregate supply curve, sometimes also known as the long-run aggregate supply curve, is showing the amount of output that will be produced when the economy is using all of its factors of production to their fullest potential. What the classical aggregate supply curve suggests is that the same amount of goods and services will be supplied regardless of the price. The aggregate supply curve that is vertical is based upon the assumption that the labor market is in equilibrium with the full employment of the labor force. So as I said, all factors of production are being used to their fullest potential. The amount of output then which is produced, we label that specifically Y star to indicate that this is the full employment or potential level of output or GDP that could be produced in an economy if all resources were being used to their fullest potential. Note that if the demand for goods and services is low, such as at AD, then the amount of output produced, if the economy was using all its resources to their fullest potential, would be Y star, and that output would be sold at a price of P. And if the, that's a bit wonky, but if the demand for goods and services is high, such as at 81, then firms will still supply a quantity of output Y star, but because the demand for goods and services is so high, that output will be sold at a much higher price. It will be sold at a price of P1. So there's then a very big distinction between the Keynesian aggregate supply curve and the classical aggregate supply curve. In the Keynesian case, the aggregate supply curve is horizontal. When the demand for goods and services changes, prices don't change, but output will change. prices are sticky or slow to adjust to changes in aggregate demand. The classical case, by contrast, is the full employment case, and here we see that when the demand for goods and services changes, it is not output which will change, it is rather prices that will change. And here we're suggesting that prices are very responsive to changes in aggregate demand. What we now need to think about is it possible, given a classical aggregate supply curve, for the amount of potential output to grow over time as the economy accumulates resources? Of course it is. We spent much of the first part of this course talking about how an economy can accumulate inputs in order to increase its output over the long run. So the economy that is able to accumulate or expand its access to resources, the economy that invests in more capital stock, both physical and knowledge capital, and the economy which utilizes technological improvements to use its existing factors of production more efficiently to produce more, will be able to achieve increases in aggregate supply in the long run. Essentially, we're suggesting that in the long run, potential GDP can increase as economies access more inputs and as they gain access to more technology. What we can see in the diagrams is that here on the right-hand side, output, and specifically potential output, can grow over time as an economy's access to resources and technology improves. On the left-hand side, we're merely measuring how output changes over time. So on the horizontal axis, we've got different time periods, and on the vertical axis, we're now measuring output. So when output is Y0 in time 0, then in the next time period, the access to resources grew and maybe technology grew, so potential output grew from Y0 to Y1. Here, we show that increase over time in output from Y0 to Y1, and so on. And what you should see is that as potential output grows in the long run, overall output can increase over time. The final thing to talk about before we cut this particular video is to think about what's going on at the full employment level of production and output in terms of the rates of unemployment. Now, when we talk about the full employment of all factors of production, we are not suggesting that there is no unemployment at all. There will be some unemployment, and the amount of unemployment that exists is going to depend on the amount of people who are between jobs, in other words, the frictionally unemployed, as well as to some extent whether or not there is structural unemployment in the economy. If you recall from Econ 102, structural unemployment would arise if there is a mismatch between the quality and skills level of the labor force and the sorts of jobs which are available in the economy. If in the economy there are lots of jobs available, but the people who are unemployed lack the skills or qualifications to be able to be employed in those jobs, then they might become structurally unemployed. It's not necessarily that the unemployed then don't have skills or don't have qualifications. It's merely that the skills and qualifications that they have do not enable them to get employed in the economy. If that's the case, it could be possible that an economy is operating at its full employment level of production and output because the firms in the economy are utilizing all of the resources they have available to them to their fullest potential. They cannot utilize the resources which do not have the requisite skills or the requisite qualifications. And so people then, even when output is at its full employment level of output and production, and factors of production are being used to their fullest potential, it's still possible that there could be people who are unemployed because they are structurally unemployed. In addition, we also have this issue of frictional unemployment. Together, the frictionally unemployed and the structurally unemployed will combine to be able to inform us on what the natural rate of unemployment is. So the natural rate of unemployment would include people who are frictionally unemployed and structurally unemployed, and it is the unemployment rate at the full employment level of output. Alright, in the next video, we will consider aggregate supply and the price adjustment mechanism.